6 games, 12 teams for the first time this season. We are pretty much completely entrenched in conference football in the SEC. This is SEC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night on video, available to you on iTunes on Thursday morning, along with Mike Loveall from Last Word on Sports. I'm Mark Rogers of Mark Rogers TV. Chad and Dave taking the week off, have some other duties elsewhere. Mike, this is a pretty amazing week of SEC football, and I believe it starts close to home for you in two different ways when we talk Tennessee and Texas A&M, and very close in the rankings, number 9 for the Vols and number 8 for the Aggies. This game intrigues me for so many reasons. The importance is without question, but also the uniqueness of the matchup, not a matchup that we often see because of the rotational system, and two programs that have proven to a certain extent that they've gone over the hump, but they can continue to do so with another win here.
Yeah, Mark, I think all those are good points. Tennessee, Texas A&M have met twice in their history. This is the first time Tennessee and Texas A&M will play since A&M became a member of the SEC. So it's the last Western opponent that Tennessee gets in the rotation. Interesting comment about both programs getting over the hump. If you look, here's the one thing that kind of I look at when I look at Texas A&M going into this game. Very talented team. I think they're much tougher than they have been in the past. But if you look at the last 3 years, this is the week where Texas A&M generally falls off. The last 3 seasons, they've started 5-1, 5-0, 5-0. The second half of the last 3 seasons, they've been 3-3, 2-5, and 3-4. So they started out 15-1 over the last 3 seasons, and they finished 8-12 in the last 3 seasons. They have Alabama coming up after Tennessee, and then they have so they have several tough conference games coming up after Alabama. So Texas A&M is looking at the Western Division race. And they've been here before. I think if you're an A&M fan, you got to kind of wonder, is this the year we can put a 12-game schedule together, or are we going to fall off? They see Tennessee, then they see Alabama, and if they hit that mark and they start 5-0 and then they end up 5-2, you might have some of that doubt coming back in the program. For Tennessee, I think it's a little bit different. Tennessee got over the Florida hump early in the season. That's been Tennessee's problem in the past few seasons, is the early games. The early part of the season. They finish strong because they usually have Missouri, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt that last half of the season. So for Tennessee, I think it's a little bit more of that impact you were talking about. Once they got past Florida and Georgia 2 weeks in a row, I think they have that over-the-hump momentum that you discussed. But, yeah, you're right. These two teams are very more similar than people think. Both of them have had great second halves of every game they've played. Both of them are athletic and dynamic and diverse on both offense and defense. So I think it's going to be a great game, Mark. Absolutely.
So when you mentioned Texas A&M's record in recent years and the difference between first half and second half, or first 5 games and final 7 games, and it's kind of a well-known narrative around the SEC that the Aggies drop off that second half of the season. I don't know so much that they drop off, but obviously it then becomes the SEC Western Division schedule. And this season, if Tennessee's as good as they possibly could be, that's almost an extension of diving into the SEC West when you get a Tennessee involved as well. What's really interesting about the Vols, and you know the Vols about as well as anyone, is in 2015, almost conversely pulling games out in 2016. So last year, Florida, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Bama, that we chronicled in many different ways throughout the offseason. So I'm not going to delve into exactly how those games were lost. But this year, of course, 21-0 down to Florida, the Georgia game down 10 several times, the App State game down 10, taken to overtime, Virginia Tech at 14-0. This is a different Tennessee team in regards to the results versus the way it played. Because if you look at the advanced metrics, Mike, and you can speak to this, in terms of game control, Tennessee, despite losing 4 games last year, was 4th in the nation in game control at 60%. And this year, that's dropped off considerably. I believe it's down to 60th in the country in game control. And also in terms of the number of plays that they've trailed throughout all their games. Last season, they trailed in 15% in a 9-4 season. This year, in an undefeated season, they're trailing 53% of the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a total opposite from last year, Mark. And having said that, coming into this week last year, they were 3-2. Coming into this week this year, they're 5-0. Of course, they would end up losing two of the next 3 at this point last season to Arkansas and Alabama. of which they both had leads in the fourth quarter of both of those games. So totally different for Tennessee. But that's okay because they're winning the games this year, and that was the knock on Tennessee last year was they were a good team, but they couldn't close it out and they couldn't win the games. And so again, Tennessee fans for the last couple of years have been under this narrative of overhyped and they can't finish. So now this year, Tennessee fans are very happy with just winning the game. They're not concerned with those advanced metrics. They're not concerned with game control. They're finally seeing the fruition of the program building that Butch Jones has done in Knoxville. And I would tell you, I think one of the reasons why they've won these games, particularly that Florida game and Georgia game in the second half, is because of the depth that he's built. A program like Tennessee is always going to have talent. But in the SEC, you have to have talent 2 and 3 deep. You have to be able to rotate defensive linemen and linebackers. In the Florida game, I believe they played 11 or 12 defensive linemen in that game, and they played 6 linebackers, and that's with Jalen Reeves may have been out after the second series, and Darren Kirkland didn't even play in that game. They still played 6 linebackers, and they were able to have a dominant second half against Florida. I don't think they played that many in the Georgia game. I think it was 9 or 10 defensive linemen and 4 or 5 linebackers, but still the depth of the rotation of talent there is an indicator that what Butch Jones has done at Tennessee as far as building the program is working and translating into wins on the field. Mark, you there?
Oh, was that me locking up? Looks like I'm going to have to edit this after. So to me, you locked up, but it must have been me, I guess.
Yeah, to me, you locked up. I was talking, and then I finished, and you were just kind of
okay.
Freeze frame. Yeah. It may have been me. It may have been you.
I can patch this up. All right, very good, very good. So a few things that stand out for me, Mike, and I need your take on this, is a lot of analysis that you did about the play of Josh Dobbs and him needing to take that next step as a polished quarterback, not a cerebral quarterback because it's well documented how cerebral he is, but in regards to taking that intelligence to the game and making right decisions and really just being a more accurate passer is one big thing. Now that we've seen him against a decent Virginia Tech defense and 2 better defenses in Florida, certainly, and Georgia. Next point, Jalen Hurd, Alvin Kamara, their statistics still belie their talent as the offensive line run blocking to the degree that they'll need to down the road if they get to an SEC championship game. And, of course, Alabama's coming up soon. Juwan Jennings, the kid catches 6 passes in 2 games, but can there be more meaningful catches out of two games with that kind of production?
Yeah, so I'll hit those in reverse orders. Juwan Jennings, interesting thing about Juwan is he came in as a highly touted quarterback out of Murfreesboro Blackman High School in the mid-state of Tennessee. He came in with Quentin Dormady and Sherian Jones. Made the transfer or made the position switch to wide receiver, and look how it's working out for him. You get a lot of these college kids these days who kind of don't want to make the position change, particularly when they come in as a quarterback. Juwan did that, and now he's pretty much he's almost reached legend status in Knoxville as a sophomore with that Hail Mary catch and the catch against Tees DeBoer in the Florida game. So Juwan Jennings having a great sophomore season, a testament to what can happen when a great athlete does what his team needs to do. In this case, it was position switch. Jalen Hurd and Alvin Kamara, if you look at the film, Mike DeBoer, the offensive coordinator, said the first half against Georgia was the offensive line's best half of play all season. They've been getting continually better. And I think they're going to continue to get better. Their run blocking actually hasn't been quite as good as people thought it would be. That's been a strength the last 2 years as opposed to their pass blocking. Butch Jones, of note, speaking of Jalen Hurd today, said that he is game time decision for the Texas A&M game with an undisclosed lower body injury. So we'll see how that goes. I think Texas A&M is going to be a good matchup for the Tennessee offensive line because Texas A&M, while they have gotten better against the run defense, they are a pass rush focused defense, particularly on the ends. Their 2 tackles do take up space, but I think Tennessee will be able to scheme against the aggressiveness of that line. And Tennessee's offensive line is much more of a what I would call a not that this term exists, but a precision blocking. They do a lot of movement, a lot of pulls. So I think they're going to be okay against Texas A&M, particularly in the run blocking. They, obviously, with Myles Garrett and Deshaun Hall, they're going to have struggle with pass blocking as any team would. And then Josh Dobbs, if you look at Josh Dobbs, the accuracy is a little bit better. And this is what I've said about Joshua Dobbs over the past 2 years. He doesn't have to win the game with his arm. He doesn't have to be great through the air because of that potent running attack and his ability to run. He just has to be a little bit better. He's been more than a little bit better this year. His accuracy is much improved, particularly the last 2 or 3 games, and particularly in the vertical passing game. So we'll see. It does still look like he has not run as much as he did last year. It almost still looks like he's on a pitch count as far as the number of times he can pull the ball and run on the ends. That's something I've been looking at, something I've been kind of surprised with, because usually once he's able to establish himself running on the ends, that kind of opens up the middle for Jalen Hurd, and it forces defensive coordinators to kind of spy him a little bit, which opens up the middle. I think this week against Texas A&M, he's going to hit the middle a lot. Look for Jason Kroom and Ethan Wolf going across that middle to have 5 targets apiece from the tight end position, and look for those quick wide receiver screens and the running back screens and draws to kind of slow down the aggressiveness and focus on the A&M linebackers, which I think is the weakness of that defense.
My quick take on the Aggies is, number one, the first thing that comes to mind in seeing most of the game against Arkansas is that this was a team that was not pushed around for the first time against a strong opponent. And when I mean strong, I mean physically strong. It's typically Arkansas, LSU, and Alabama in particular that have pushed around the Aggies in the second half of the season during that slide that we've talked about. But this was a team that on a number of occasions came up against a 3rd and short, 4th and short against that Arkansas running game, and they stood tall and they shut it down, and they owned the line of scrimmage in those situations. Next would be Trevor Knight. I believe he needs to have his best game of the season. He's been good in spots. He's been a running threat. Not that he's a dynamic runner, but he's a threat. He keeps defenses honest in the running game, and he makes the right decisions in the read option of when to keep it, when to give it to the back. And speaking of backs, Travion Williams has been exceptional against really good defenses. He's averaging over 9 yards a carry against the likes of UCLA, Auburn, and Arkansas. 3 pretty stout defenses this year.
Mark, some great points. First of all, hit the A&M defense. They are much tougher. They're a much improved unit. This A&M team is a legitimate top 10 team. Of course, you look at John Chavis. Kevin Sumlin was able to pull him away from LSU 2 years ago. Chavis obviously is a Tennessee guy, coached defensive coordinator at Tennessee for years under Phil Fulmer, to include the 98 championship season. So everybody knows what John Chavis can do with the defense. He kind of helped build the defense that LSU's had for the past 8 or 9 years when he was a defensive coordinator there. So Chavis in the second year is obviously going to have a much tougher defense and a much better defense, and they've shown that on the field. Here's the thing about Trevor Knight. By my count, there are at least 11 starting transfer quarterbacks in Power 5 conferences. I think Trevor Knight's the most valuable transfer quarterback of all those guys. Maybe Davis Webb second out in California. But Trevor Knight has been more important to the A&M team after that disastrous offseason than any other transfer quarterback I can think of off the top of my head. Again, 11 transfer starting quarterbacks in P5. That kind of struck me as extremely odd. But that's how important Trevor Knight's been to this A&M team. That quarterback position was a tremendous question mark with the 2 starters leaving before the bowl game last year and then going into the offseason. Trevor Knight's come into the locker room. He's provided that leadership, that senior presence at the quarterback position, which is obviously the most critical position to have that intangibles. He's provided that, given that to this team, and he's executed on the field as well. By far, I think the most important transfer quarterback of all 11 of those guys across the nation this season. Very important for A&M that he continues his good play.
On Saturday night, we've got a date in the SEC Western Division that should be a white knuckler when it comes to physicality, not necessarily the result at the end of the game or the final score, when the Crimson Tide at 5-0 meet the Razorbacks, 16th ranked, currently at 4-1, losing to the aforementioned Aggies, a game in which that was back and forth and right within reach with about 10 minutes to play. Then it got out of hand, and Texas A&M's offense took over, and the defense with a number of crucial stops. So in this one, it's almost as though Alabama's season is hinged in sorts because of Arkansas the last 2 years. So the last trip to Fayetteville was a 14-13 game in which Arkansas blew it with a missed PAT and a fumble at some point in the game inside the 5-yard line. There was a big defensive stand on 4th down against Arkansas's running game, either Collins or Williams, And the Tide prevailed and, of course, marched on to Atlanta and the college football playoff. Last year, not necessarily when the two teams were on the field, although the Arkansas Razorbacks did play a close game in Tuscaloosa, but later in the season, needing a loss by Ole Miss, of course, Hunter Henry and the crew pulled it out on a 4th and 25 in overtime to send Alabama on to the SEC championship game. So we've got a game that I think Alabama is certainly the favorite in regards to top to bottom talent on the roster, but Arkansas brings their brand of football and will go toe-to-toe with the Crimson Tide, Mike.
Yeah, great points, Mark. Last year they beat Tennessee as an underdog and really affected Tennessee's season. That caused Tennessee not to go to the SEC East. The year previous to that, you mentioned they beat LSU and Ole Miss, which had dramatic effects in the SEC West. And then 4 years ago they beat Auburn in a season where they went 4-8. Still got to win against Auburn. So Arkansas seems like one of those teams that hasn't been able to get into the top half of the SEC West, but they're still a team that you don't want to play because they seem to always beat a highly ranked team every year and pull that out. They're a tough team. Of course, they get that from their coach, Brett Bielema. Austin Allen trying to replace his brother. He's played well. But again, as good as A&M's defense is, I don't think they're as good as Alabama's defense. Again, going back to the linebacker position, Alabama is so dominant with the front seven, and those linebackers can also help in the pass coverage that they're just a complete defense. I think A&M has a good back end, and I think they got a good front four, but I think their weakness is the linebackers. I really think it's going to present a challenge for Arkansas. Their run game is not as strong as it's been in the past, and nor do I believe Austin Allen is quite as good as Brandon Allen is at this point in his career. So I think Alabama's going to be able to control this game, particularly on the defensive side, and I think their offense is still getting in rhythm. The more reps that Jalen Hurts gets, the better that offense is going to be. And as long as they can stay healthy, I think Alabama's going to be able to move the ball. I also think Alabama's going to have a significant advantage as far as special teams go. That could be the portion of the game that kind of seals it for Alabama.
Yeah, the Crimson Tide in the season opener faced a USC offensive line that was much heralded and completely ripped them to shreds against Ole Miss, even though the Rebels had to replace some starters along the offensive front, 3 or 4 of the listed 5 deep from last year. And, of course, Laramie Tunsil, still a very talented, very good Ole Miss offensive line that's going to hold up against just about everybody else. Of course, Chad Kelly did make plays in that game, but the difference in the game was Alabama disrupting Chad Kelly, taking him off his mark and actually taking the football away from him. So the Alabama front against Arkansas's offensive line and an Austin Allen who is not going to make plays with his feet on a regular basis, I think is going to be critical for Arkansas to protect Austin Allen, even though we think Arkansas, run first, establish the run, win with the run, try to run 70-30. Austin Allen in what was the biggest win of the year to date in going to TCU, put it on his back in the fourth quarter, and he won the game, making the right throws, the right reads, and really throwing into tight windows against what was a TCU defense that's been shredded a few times, but they certainly looked good for 3+ quarters that night against Arkansas. But Austin Allen played really well against them, and that was a game that really impressed me because he was beat up and he was knocked around. What impressed me against Texas A&M, not necessarily that he responded with big throws or big plays against A&M late in the game, but just survived the game because they really beat him up when talking about Austin Allen. So he could be in for another rough ride physically and trying to get through the game and be upright in the fourth quarter against Alabama.
Yeah, Mark, something else to look at this game, and I think Arkansas is a good team, but something else that's pointing against them, not in their favor, is the last 2 years when it's been close. Look at who Alabama's had to play before Arkansas. They had to play Georgia last year before Arkansas, and then Ole Miss the year before. If you go back 3 and 4 years when they had a similar schedule where they had 2 lesser opponents before Arkansas, they beat up on Arkansas pretty bad. They've had it's been 3 weeks since the Alabama-Ole Miss game. They've had Kent State and Kentucky at home. So this trip to Arkansas is not coming off an emotional loss to Ole Miss. It's not coming off an emotional road win against Georgia like it was last year. They've had 2 weeks to kind of go through the motion, work out the kinks against teams that weren't going to threaten them to a large extent. So I think if you look at the past 2 years, it might be a little bit deceiving because of the factors that went on before the game as far as the previous opponents as opposed to this year. I think this year sets up well for Alabama.
Mike Loveall and myself joining you for SEC Breakdown. We come your way typically with David Waters and Chad Niebling every Wednesday night on YouTube, and you can catch us on audio on iTunes on Thursday morning. Mike Loveall on Last Word on Sports. Check out his work there. Very analytical, very much different than what you'll catch the run-of-the-mill analysis and so forth across college football. From me, it's Mark Rogers TV on YouTube as I cover not just the SEC, but the entire landscape of college football as we talk some LSU and Florida, Mike. The Gators come in 4-1. The Tigers with some life after rolling past Mizzou at home last week, 42-7. The Gators lethargic, sloppy in that noon game at Nashville. Got it done against Vandy, which is barely at 13-6. Your initial thoughts about the Gators and the Tigers?
Well, it's going to be interesting. Still not sure we know whether or not Leonard Fournette's going to play. The other thing about this game is we have to look at how the weather is going to affect it. Probably going to have heavy rains hit Florida, right close to Jacksonville in the Gainesville area with the Hurricane Matthew, I believe, coming up the coast. So you look at that, and you got to think that helps LSU, probably more of a ground team. Florida, I think, probably is going to rely more on the quarterback. Not sure if Luke Del Rio is going to play, come back in this game or not. LSU's look good last week. A very popular pick to be upset last week with a Missouri team riding high coming in. Brand new coach after the Les Miles fiasco. Ed Orgeron takes over. They kind of change up their offense, and they come out and they look really good. They look much improved from the previous week, and their offense was able to move the ball and score against Missouri, who still has a fairly strong defense. But everybody was kind of thinking Missouri might have a chance to capitalize on some drama in Baton Rouge, and that was not the case. LSU came out and took care of business. So you look at that. Can they continue on that momentum? Florida, coming off that loss to Tennessee, and then last week in Nashville, just was not able to move the ball very much at all. And so I think if you go back the last 6 quarters, they have not looked good. And if you go back the last 6 games, going back to last year, their offense has had some problems. There's starting to be some conversation in Gainesville about, is this working, or is it a kind of a sophomore slump for the Alabama offense? There's starting to be some tough conversations in Gainesville. So I think this is a much more important game for Jim McElwain and the Gators than it is for the LSU Tigers. LSU's kind of playing with house money. They got a brand new coach who's in on interim status. So you know what's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen is they play like people think they're going to play, which is a team that has an interim coach that just fired their head coach. So I think they're playing with house money. I think they're a loose group. I think the offensive coordinator is kind of free. He can call what he wants. Not a lot of pressure there. I think LSU comes out. I think the weather helps LSU. I think their offensive coordinator I think their offense continues to get better. I look for LSU to make a statement here that they're back nationally on the scene. I think LSU comes out of Gainesville with a win.
Mike, when you check out the stat line for LSU against Mizzou and a first game that was called by Steve Emsinger in relief of Cam Cameron, of course, who was dismissed, it's not just the gaudy statistics, it's that it's the LSU blueprint for a win. So 634 total yards of offense, that's an SEC record for an LSU team against a conference opponent. 82 plays, 52 of those runs, 30 passes. 8 yards per carry without Leonard Fournette, 42 minutes of time possession to 18 for Missouri, no turnovers, 6 for 11 on third downs. That's a scripted LSU offensive performance. What stands out to me about Florida is Jordan Scarlett appears to be the best running back. A lot of Gator insiders, including our own David Waters, are clamoring for Scarlett to get the ball more consistently. 12 carries last week, 10 against Tennessee. He's getting about 35 to 40% of the carries out of the running backs. So they're relieving him quite a bit. And the one productive series that they had in scoring a touchdown and marching on a long field for a touchdown against Vandy, he got most of the carries. And then we didn't see him for like 25 minutes in that game. The offensive line has been porous, giving up sacks even to 3- and 4-man fronts, and even not being able to run the ball consistently against defenses that aren't even loading the box. So it's been a bit of a strain in trying to produce offense for Florida, and it's going to be difficult, you would think, in this one. Defensively for the Gators, they do what we expect them to from a production standpoint. They are one of the best. One of the concerns from the Vandy game would be that Ralph Webb and the Vandy rushing game did gain some yardage and was able to move the ball and keep the ball away from Florida's offense with about 150 yards rushing in that game. So, Mike, as we go along with these games, if you want to throw out a pick, that's totally up to you. But I'm going to save those for later. So, Mark Rogers TV, I've got my picks coming later this week. We've got Georgia. We got South Carolina. So for a number of years, of course, this was the game in the SEC Eastern Division during Spurrier's near his last season there at South Carolina. Of course, the Gamecocks getting off the deck with Will Muschamp on the sidelines. And if for a program like South Carolina, Mike, if they can win the games that they're supposed to, this not being one, but they're winning most of the games that they're supposed to with Will Muschamp and rebuilding at the same time, then that's a win-win for them. Georgia, of course, now has lost 2 games in conference, lost the big one that they had right in their hands that they let slip away. So we got Georgia going to Columbia.
Yeah, Mark, the South Carolina offense has not looked good at all this season. Eked out a win against Vanderbilt and then lost to Kentucky. So you South Carolina fans have got to be wondering, is this what Will Muschamp brings to this team? It looks a lot like Florida minus the athletes that naturally gravitate to Florida. For Georgia, I think this is a very important game for Georgia. They built a little bit of momentum against Tennessee. Of course, they came off that Ole Miss loss. Ole Miss just crushed them. A lot of question marks in Athens. They were able to very quickly get things back together and look very good against the Tennessee team that was favored considerably after that second half against Florida, and Georgia had that game there at the end until the last 4 seconds. So Georgia fans are kind of thinking, we got rid of Mark Richt. Look at what he's doing at Miami. Now we're early in the season through 5 games, and we've already got 2 losses. So we got rid of a guy who just all he did was win 10 games a season. Now we've already got 2 losses in the first 5 games. So I think it's very important for Georgia. I think Will Muschamp's still playing. He's got a little bit of patience and leeway in South Carolina. Early in his career there. Georgia, I think there's a lot more pressure when you fire a guy that just wins 10 games a year. You don't really have a lot of patience for rebuilding, particularly with a big name like Kirby Smart coming in. I think Georgia was able to get things back together. I look for them to roll against South Carolina. That offense is Jacob Eason's looking good at quarterback. The question mark with Georgia is still, why are they not able to run as effectively with all those great running backs in their backfield? So we'll see. I think Georgia puts things together. I think they really bounce back well from Ole Miss against Tennessee. I think they continue that. Again, this is another game where the weather is going to affect it. Maybe change the start time, maybe push it later. It will probably be a wet environment, which I think probably plays to South Carolina because it prevents the score from getting out of control. But again, I think Georgia handles it. I think Georgia's starting to find their rhythm after that Ole Miss game. Where they just didn't show up, find the rhythm against Tennessee. I think they come out and I think they handle business with South Carolina.
Hey, Mike, before we get too many East-West games under our belts, I would love to get your projection on this because obviously since Urban Meyer walked off the field for the last time for Florida in the SEC championship game against Alabama, and obviously he came back one more season after that, but basically that was the transition of power from East to West, and the Western Division led by Alabama has not looked back since. We've had a couple indications of the way that might go, and what brought this to mind was your comments about Georgia's struggles at Ole Miss and then being able to turn around the next week at home against Tennessee and come that close to beating what we expect to be the best team in the Eastern Division. I don't want to go with the transitive property based on 2 games, but we do have a couple under our belts. We have like-seeded teams with Mississippi State and South Carolina, and the Bulldogs taking care of business by a couple touchdowns against the Gamecocks. And now we really dive into some heavyweights when you talk LSU and Florida, and especially Tennessee and Texas Tech, Texas A&M. So your thoughts about, based on what you've seen, what you know of the personnel, the coaches on the sideline, if we can expect the SEC Western Division dominance to continue?
I think we do. I think the SEC West is still by far the better of the 2 divisions, competing with the ACC Coastal, I believe, and the Big Ten East. as the three best divisions in college football. I think those three are clearly head and shoulders above everyone else division-wise. In the SEC, I think the West is still clearly head and shoulders. Like you said, we'll know more after this Saturday. Tennessee, who is obviously standings-wise tops in the East and they control their own destiny with a 2-game lead against Florida and Georgia, playing which is probably the second best team in the West, Texas A&M, and then of course Florida, who is either 2 or 3 in the East, playing LSU, which at this point really is probably at best 4th in the West. And you got Alabama, Texas A&M, probably Ole Miss coming in at 3rd. We don't know about Arkansas yet. Close loss to Texas A&M. Arkansas could be 4th. Auburn could be 4th if they figure things out there. So LSU is at best 4th or 5th, playing the number 2 East team, and I think LSU is going to win that game. So I think there's clearly a dividing line between the West and the East, and I think the West is still better, particularly when you get down to the 4, 5, 6, and 7 slots where you have LSU, Auburn, Arkansas battling for that 4, 5, and 6. In the East, you have Kentucky, South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Missouri battling in that 4, 5, 6, 7 positions. So I think at the top, we'll see how Tennessee fares against Texas A&M and Alabama. Florida and Georgia have the potential to hold their own, but once you get to the 4, 5, and 6 positions, the disparity I think is quite a bit between the quality of those teams between the West and the East.
Mike, I see those eyebrows working when you're trying to differentiate between the ACC Coastal and the Atlantic, and I do the same thing, and I talk ACC football almost every day, and it's like, which one am I talking about here? Okay, so we've got Auburn, we got Mississippi State, of course, the Bulldogs. Clearly at this point seem to be the worst team, and of course we're talking again about most likely the best division in college football, so not a bad team, but most likely the worst team in the SEC Western Division. I've been impressed with the Auburn defense. I've been impressed with the win over LSU. I know that the Tigers, meaning LSU, were in disarray at the time, and that was the last stand for Les Miles and Cam Cameron, but they win a big game at home. They got Louisiana Monroe and did what you would expect an SEC power or mid-tier power at this point in the game to do to Louisiana Monroe. So we've got Auburn going to Starkville, Mike.
Yeah, I think Auburn's another team that's kind of finding their rhythm. I'm really interested on the fact that Gus Malzahn is turning over play calling duties to Rhett Lashley. So we'll see how that goes. We'll see how the Auburn offense responds. The Bulldogs have some question marks too. They're in the post-Dak era, and as you see guys like Les Miles leave LSU, and as you start hearing about talk with Charlie Strong at Texas, one of the guys that's going to start getting phone calls is the head coach there, Dan Mullen in Mississippi State. So you gotta wonder how all that outside noise affects that team. They're still trying to get a good answer at quarterback. 2 guys there that can stand under center for Mississippi State. And so I think there's a lot of questions around that program. That's a program that is constantly battling for relevancy in the SEC West. They kind of get up there under the Dak Prescott years, and then they desperately want to hang on to 2nd, 3rd, 4th place in the SEC West. But it's so competitive, now it looks like they're slipping back into the solid 7 position. Auburn's coming in, a lot of talent there. Defense has looked really good. If you look at what Clemson was able to do against Louisville, and then you go back to that first game and look how Auburn's defense really dominated that Clemson offense, you got to think that Auburn's defense is in a really good position. If they can just find a rhythm on offense, if they can settle on a quarterback and get that guy snaps and get his rhythm down with the rest of the offense, I think Auburn has a chance to make some noise, win 8 or 9 games this season, possibly even more. So I think Auburn's going to win this game. I think as the season goes on and the quarterback situation gets settled at Auburn and whoever it is gets more snaps, probably Sean White, I think you're going to see Auburn get better and better and be a strong contender for a not a New Year's Eve 6 bowl, but probably the Outback Bowl or Tax Slayer Bowl or something like that. And I think they'll probably finish the season very strong, and I think they'll handle business with Mississippi State this weekend.
And considering what the Auburn defense was able to do, even though it was about a double-digit loss, I believe 26-10, something in that range against Texas A&M, considering what the Aggies have done against a good Arkansas defense, and then Auburn got basically no help from its offense in the second half of that game and continued to stop the Aggies time after time to at least keep it within 2 scores. I think Gus Malzahn's done a pretty good job. Once he settled the quarterback situation, it took him way too long to do that. It was a game on the Plains on opening night that looked like a lost cause from kickoff, but as it played out, because of his defense, could have been a win for the Auburn Tigers, and obviously that's ancient history at this point, but had they settled the quarterback issue at that point, maybe they pull off a monumental upset. Vandy at Kentucky, Mike. Commodores coming off what we have grown to know in being the formula for the better Vanderbilt. I won't say a winning formula, but a let's stay close formula against Florida in squeezing the game down, taking the air out of the football, maximizing the running game with Ralph Webb in particular, playing very solid defense, albeit Florida certainly helps on the offensive side and keeping that game close. Kentucky with a big win a couple weeks ago against South Carolina at home at 17-10. Did what we expected them to do against Alabama, although they kept it within a couple scores in the first half in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, I think this is a game against with two coaches who are both on the hot seat. Stoops at Kentucky, probably a little bit more pressure on him than Derek Mason at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt hasn't looked good last week, even though I think last week was more of Florida playing very poorly than Vanderbilt coming out like gangbusters. They went down to Georgia Tech, didn't look good against Georgia Tech at all. And then kind of that opening game against South Carolina. Again, neither one of those teams looked very good. Ralph Webb is a good running back. Kentucky's got a good running back as well in Boone Williams. I think Kentucky has the pieces. They have a little bit more talent than Vanderbilt. Of course, their defense has struggled this year. Gave up the lead to Southern Miss in a bad loss there and just got destroyed by Florida. Those were the first two games. Come back, escape New Mexico State, beat South Carolina. I think built some momentum against Alabama. They didn't get crushed by Alabama. So I think they look at Vanderbilt coming up, then they got a bye week, and they got Mississippi State at Missouri. They've got 3 winnable games and a bye week coming up in the next 4 weeks. They got to be thinking to themselves, okay, the last couple of years we started out strong, 5-0, and then we've lost 6 straight. Maybe this is the year where we start out slow and we build momentum and we finally get to a bowl at the end of the season with a strong second half of the season. So I think there's a little bit more momentum in Lexington than there is in Nashville. But we'll see. I think the weakness of Kentucky's defense is not as exploitable by Vanderbilt, whose offense I'm still not sold on Kyle Shermer and Vanderbilt's ability to put a lot of points on the board against an SEC defense. I think Kentucky wins this. I think their offense is able to do a little bit more against Vanderbilt's decent defense than Vanderbilt's offense is able to do against Kentucky's defense.
This is SEC Breakdown. It's your show of record for SEC football. We come your way on YouTube every Wednesday night, typically with David Waters and Chad Niebling. This week with Mike Loveall of Last Word on Sports, who joins us as a core 4 here on SEC Breakdown each and every Wednesday night. Myself, Mark Rogers. You can catch me covering college football coast to coast on Mark Rogers TV. Again, catch Mike as well on Last Word on Sports. In terms of SEC Breakdown, you need to join us on Twitter and Facebook. We are pumping out content throughout the week, previews and game recaps, analysis on and off the field concerning everything regarding SEC football. So for Mike Loveall, I'm Mark Rogers. We will see you next week on SEC Breakdown.